The gravel bit into my knees that October night in 1965 when I was 20, pulled over on County Road 47 outside Millbrook, Iowa. Rain hammered my thin dress as Deputy Frank Morrison yanked me from my Ford pickup, his badge gleaming under lightning that split the sky like God's own fury. Well, little Sarah running away again. His voice cut through thunder as he shoved me toward the ditch. I knew that voice had heard it screaming at me for 15 years, felt the fist that came with it. But this time, he wore the uniform that made him untouchable in our small farming community of 800 souls. His flashlight beam danced across my face as he pressed me against his patrol car's cold metal. "You thought you could hide from me forever, didn't you? Thought you could just disappear into the night like some scared rabbit." The assault that followed left me bleeding on wet asphalt, his hands tearing at clothes while thunder drowned my screams. When it was over, when he'd taken what he wanted one last time, he stood adjusting his belt with mechanical precision and said the words that would haunt me. "You know too much about me, about your real father, about everything that could destroy my reputation in this town. I can't let you leave Sarah. I can't let you talk." That's when I understood he meant to kill me. But I'm 75 now, telling this story from my home in Santa Barbara, where Pacific breezes carry away the dust of Iowa storms. The scar on my thigh reminds me how a girl became a survivor, not through some miracle, but through grit luck and the terrible mathematics of endurance. This is how I lived. This is how I learned that sometimes the only way out is through. Born in 1945 to struggling farmers in rural Iowa, I was 5 when the late droughts turned our 40 acres of corn and soybeans into cracked earth. My father, Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison, ruled our isolated farmhouse with a badge, a bottle of bourbon that never seemed empty, and fists that left marks in places no one would see. Our house sat at the end of a dirt road 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon like a brown ocean. The isolation wasn't accidental. Frank preferred it that way, easier to keep family secrets when no one could hear the screaming. "Sarah, mind your mother." He'd bark every morning, adjusting his gun belt before heading into town for patrol. The pressed uniform hanging in our front hallway wasn't just his job. It was his armor against anyone who might question what happened behind our peeling white doors. Mother Elizabeth had tuberculosis contracted from her time in migrant camps during the Dust Bowl years. She spent most days in the narrow bedroom she shared with Frank, coughing blood into embroidered handkerchiefs I'd wash by hand in our kitchen sink, the red stains never quite coming clean. "Fetch water from the well, sweetheart," she'd whisper during her increasingly rare lucid moments, her voice like autumn leaves rustling. "And remember, whatever happens in this house, stays in this house." People wouldn't understand our family's business. The town of Millbrook knew Frank Morrison as their dedicated lawman. Population 847, mostly German and Irish farmers who'd settled there after the Civil War. At Morrison's General Store, no relation to us despite the shared name, folks would nod approvingly when his name came up. "That Frank Morrison keeps our county safe," Mrs. Henderson would say, stacking canned peaches with flour-dusted hands. "Works all hours, never complains about the pay. His little Sarah should be proud to have such a devoted father." I'd smile the way children learn when truth is too dangerous to tell, my lips stretch thin over gritted teeth. Sunday mornings at First Lutheran Church were performances worthy of Broadway. Frank would guide Mother's frail form down the center aisle, his hand gentle on her elbow, nodding to neighbors with the solemn dignity of a man bearing life's burdens with Christian grace. I'd walk behind them in my best dress, hand-sewn by Mother during one of her better weeks, keeping my eyes down, hands folded. "Morning, Sarah," Reverend Walsh would say, patting my head with his soft pastor's palm. "How's your dear mother feeling this week?" "Better, thank you, Reverend. The prayers help." Another rehearsed response, smooth as river stones worn by repetition. What they didn't see was Frank's grip tightening on Mother's arm. During hymns, his fingers finding pressure points that would leave finger-shaped bruises hidden beneath her long sleeves. they didn't hear him muttering threats during prayer, his voice covered by the congregation's murmured amens. The first crack in my carefully constructed silence came during a routine doctor's visit when I was 8. Dr. Patterson, the only physician within 30 miles, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a gentle way of asking questions that made children want to tell the truth. "Those are interesting bruises, Sarah," he said, examining purple fingerprints on my upper arms during a checkup for what Mother called growing pains. "Can you tell me how you got them?" I recited my lines perfectly. "Helping Daddy move hay bales? He says I'm clumsy, always getting in the way of farm work." Dr. Patterson wrote careful notes in his leather-bound file, his fountain pen scratching against paper in the quiet examination room. He never explained why he documented everything with such precision, but something in his eyes suggested he was building a record for future use. That night, Frank came home late from his patrol shift, bourbon on his breath and suspicion in his pale blue eyes. "Doc Patterson been asking questions about you today?" he said, hanging his gun belt on the wooden peg by our kitchen door. His voice was deceptively calm the way it got before storms. "Hope you didn't give him any wrong ideas about how we raise children in this house?" I shook my head quickly, too quickly. His hand moved faster than I could dodge, catching me across the mouth, hard enough to split my lower lip. The taste of copper flooded my tongue as I stumbled backward into our kitchen table. "Good," he said, examining his knuckles with clinical interest. "Because little girls who tell tales about their daddies sometimes have accidents. Bad accidents that doctors can't fix." That night, I lay in my narrow bed, tasting blood and understanding, for the first time, that Frank Morrison's protection came with a price I was too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to fear. In the darkness, Mother's voice drifted through our thin walls. "Mama made a mistake once, a terrible mistake that hurt everyone. Promise me you'll be better than I was, Sarah. Promise me you'll be brave when the time comes." I promised into my pillow, not knowing what bravery would cost or how long I'd wait to find it. Summer 1957 arrived with heat that cracked the earth and shortened everyone's temper. The corn in our fields withered to brown stalks, and the well water dropped so low I had to lower our bucket twice as far to reach the muddy bottom. At 12, I was old enough to understand the weight of adult silences, the meaning behind Frank's increasingly violent mood swings, but still too small to fight back effectively. Mother's tuberculosis had worsened over the harsh winter, leaving her bedridden most days and dependent on morphine that Dr. Patterson prescribed in carefully measured doses. Her coughing fits echoed through our house at night like the sound of dying things, and I'd learned to sleep with a pillow over my head to muffle the noise. The incident that changed everything started on a Tuesday afternoon in July with something as simple as spilled milk. I'd been carrying our dented aluminum pail from the barn where our single cow, Bessie, had grudgingly provided barely enough milk for our morning coffee and evening cornbread. The heat had made me dizzy, and my foot caught on a loose board in our porch steps, the third one from the bottom that Frank kept promising to fix, but never did. The pail tumbled from my hands, fresh milk splashing across sun-baked dirt, like spilled paint soaking into earth, so dry it might as well have been concrete. From inside the house came the sound of Frank's rocking chair scraping against the kitchen floor, the chair where he sat cleaning his service revolver and drinking bourbon after his shifts. "Goddamn clumsy little bitch." His voice carried across the yard before I even saw him emerge from the house. He was still buttoning his uniform shirt, a half-empty bourbon bottle dangling from his left fist. "Do you have any idea what milk costs? How hard I work to keep food on this table." I scrambled to right the pail, my hands shaking as I tried to salvage what little remained. "I'm sorry, Daddy. It was an accident. The board was loose and I—" His work boot, steel-toed and polished to regulation shine, connected with my ribs hard enough to lift me clean off the ground. I crashed into the porch railing, breath knocked out in a whoosh of pain that made my vision go gray around the edges. Through blurred sight, I saw him unbuckling his leather belt, the thick one with the brass buckle that bore the county sheriff's department seal.
Sorry doesn't buy milk, he said, advancing with the deliberate steps of a man who'd done this before. Sorry doesn't make up for having a worthless daughter who can't handle one simple chore without fucking it up. The beating that followed left welts across my back and arms, each strike of leather against skin, accompanied by a litany of my failures, wasteful, stupid, useless, just like my whore mother. But I'd endured Frank's belt before. What came after in the humid darkness of our barn broke something inside me that would never fully heal. The barn smelled of hay and cow dung and the sweet rot of apples falling from our gnarled tree. Frank dragged me inside by my hair past Bessie's stall, where she lowed nervously, sensing violence in the air. He threw me down onto the hay bales we used for Bessie's bedding, the dry stalks scratching against my face and arms. "You're old enough now," he whispered, his bourbon breath hot against my ear as he pinned me down with his full weight. "Old enough to start earning your keep around here. Old enough to learn what daughters owe their daddies." His hands went places they had no right to go, exploring my changing body with the casual ownership of a man examining livestock. I tried to fight, tried to scream, but he was too strong, and my voice came out as nothing more than pathetic whimpers. When it was over, when he'd taken what he wanted and left me bleeding and shaking in the hay, Frank adjusted his uniform as if nothing had happened. Every button precisely aligned, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. "This is our family business now," he said, buckling his gun belt back into place. "You tell anyone about what happens between us, anyone at all, and I'll kill your mother. Make it look like her tuberculosis finally won. Who's going to question a deputy sheriff about a sick woman who couldn't fight off pneumonia?" The threat wasn't empty. I'd seen Frank's incident report stacked on his desk, heard his casual lies to other officers about domestic disturbances that ended with no charges filed, no follow-up required. His badge made him judge, jury, and executioner in Millbrook County. That night marked the end of my childhood and the beginning of an education in survival that no 12-year-old should ever receive. I learned to read the signs of Frank's approaching rage, the set of his jaw when he came home from difficult shifts, the particular way he'd slam car doors when his authority had been challenged, the rhythm of his drinking that predicted violence like a barometer predicting storms. I also learned that adults lie. The teachers who preached about protecting children, the neighbors who smiled and waved from their pickup trucks, the congregation that praised Frank's service to the community, they were all complicit in their willful blindness. If I was going to survive, it would be on my own terms, with my own resources. From the Millbrook Public Library, I stole a nursing manual that taught me to clean wounds properly, to recognize signs of infection, to fashion splints from kindling wood and strips of cloth. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, noticed my interest in medical texts, but attributed it to academic curiosity rather than desperate necessity. Such a bright girl, she'd tell Mother during their brief encounters at Morrison's General Store. "Always reading, always learning. You should be proud." The nursing book became my Bible, teaching me skills that would keep me alive when Frank's violence escalated. I learned to treat cuts with hydrogen peroxide stolen from Dr. Patterson's office, to set minor fractures using techniques described in clinical detail to hide evidence of abuse beneath carefully applied makeup and strategic clothing choices. The next morning, Mother asked about my swollen lip and the way I held my left side when I walked. "Fell off Bessie while trying to milk her." I lied smoothly, the fabrication rolling off my tongue like honey. "You know how clumsy I am around animals?" Mother nodded absently, already retreating into the morphine haze that offered her the only escape she'd ever know. That lie became the template for all the others that would follow, carefully constructed explanations that painted Frank as a concerned father, struggling to manage an accident-prone daughter. But Dr. Patterson was writing longer notes during our visits, now his fountain pen pausing frequently as he studied my face with those kind, knowing eyes. Something was building in the adult world around me, some awareness I didn't fully understand yet, but could sense like approaching thunder. It gave me my first real taste of hope, and my first understanding of how dangerous hope could be in Frank Morrison's house. Winter 1958 descended on Iowa like God's own punishment, burying our farm in snowdrifts taller than fence posts and trapping us in an isolation that Frank wielded like another weapon. The blizzard started in November and didn't stop until March, each storm adding another layer to our prison of white. At 13, my body was changing in ways that drew Frank's attention more frequently and more dangerously. Where once his violence had been sporadic, driven by alcohol and frustration, now it carried a different quality, more focused, more intimate, more terrifying in its implications. During a particularly vicious February storm that howled around our house for 3 straight days, I was carrying armloads of split wood from our lean-to shed to keep our kitchen stove burning. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, and every step was treacherous with hidden ice. I was on my 4th trip when disaster struck. My foot found a patch of ice concealed beneath fresh snow, and my ankle twisted with a crack I felt more than heard. The firewood scattered across our yard like giant pickup sticks. As I went down hard, my breath exploding in white puffs that dissipated instantly in the frigid air. Through our kitchen window, I could see Frank's silhouette dark against the yellow lamplight, his form swaying slightly in the way that meant he was 3 drinks past reasonable. He emerged from the house without a coat, his rage apparently warming him against the sub-zero temperature. "Can't even walk without screwing up," he snarled, kicking at the scattered firewood with his steel-toed boots. Each piece he kicked landed with dull thuds in the snow around me. "Look at this mess. Look at what you've done now." I tried to explain about the hidden ice, about the patch that had caught my foot without warning, but his boot found my ribs before I could finish the sentence. The impact drove me deeper into the snow, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Ribs, maybe 2 of them, making each breath feel like swallowing broken glass. "Get up!" he commanded, his voice carrying the authority he used with suspects who gave him trouble. When I struggled to rise on my twisted ankle, pain shooting up my leg like lightning, I collapsed again into the snow. This time, I couldn't swallow the cry that escaped my lips. Frank's response was methodical and brutal. Boot after boot, finding my back, my shoulders, my kidneys. Each blow delivered with the precision of a man who knew exactly how much damage he could inflict without leaving permanent, visible evidence. I said, "Get up," he roared, his voice echoing across our empty fields. "My dead mother could carry more wood than you, and she's been in the ground for 15 years. From inside the house came Mother's weak voice, barely audible over the wind. Frank, what's happening out there?" His tone shifted instantly to that of the concerned husband and devoted father. "Nothing to worry about," Elizabeth Sarah just took a little spill on the ice. "You know how treacherous it gets after these storms." He leaned down close to my ear as I lay bleeding in the snow, his breath visible in white puffs that smelled of bourbon and tobacco. "You tell her you slipped on the porch steps," he whispered. "You tell her the ice made you fall. One word about anything else, one hint that I had to discipline you for your clumsiness, and I'll drag her out here and make her watch while I finish what I started. You understand me?" I nodded through chattering teeth, tasting blood from where I'd bitten my tongue during the beating. Frank scooped me up in his arms, then carrying me toward the house like a concerned father helping his injured daughter. The performance was flawless, just in case Mother happened to be watching from the window. The next few weeks passed in a haze of pain and careful deception. My ribs made breathing an agony, each inhalation feeling like knives between my bones. My ankle swelled to twice its normal size, the joint so tender I could barely put weight on it. I treated both injuries with supplies stolen from Dr. Patterson's office during our monthly visits. Bandages, iodine, aspirin tablets I crushed and mixed with water to make a paste for the worst bruises. Following instructions memorized from the nursing manual, I bound my ribs with strips torn from old bedsheets,
wrapping them tight enough to provide support, but not so tight as to restrict breathing. The ankle I treated with cold compresses made from snow wrapped in dish towels, elevating it whenever I could find privacy to do so. When infection set in, announced by red streaks radiating from the worst scrapes and a fever that left me delirious, I treated it with sulfur powder, stolen from our veterinary supplies. The same medicine we used on Bessie's cuts worked well enough on human wounds, though the burning sensation was nearly unbearable. One night, lost in fever dreams and desperate to reach our outhouse, I nearly froze to death, wandering through the drifted snow, in nothing but my nightgown. My bare feet went numb almost immediately, and I lost all sense of direction in the whirling white. Only the sound of our old rooster crowing at dawn gave me bearing enough to crawl home through snowdrifts on my hands and knees. Frank found me collapsed on our kitchen floor, hypothermic, and barely conscious my skin blue white with cold. For just one moment, so brief I might have imagined it, I saw something like genuine concern flicker across his face. Then calculation replaced it, his mind already working on the story he'd tell if anyone asked questions.
"Damn girl's too stupid to dress warm for a trip to the outhouse,"
he muttered, wrapping me in blankets and positioning me near our kitchen stove. When Mother asked what had happened, stirring from her morphine-induced stupor, with more awareness than she'd shown in weeks, Frank spun an elaborate story about childhood sleepwalking phases that doctors said were perfectly normal. At school, when classes finally resumed after the worst of the storms passed, my teacher, Mrs. Campbell, noticed the way I favored my left side and limped slightly on my still tender ankle. "Everything all right at home, Sarah?" she asked one afternoon, approaching my desk with the careful manner of someone trying not to spook a wild animal. Her gray hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and her brown eyes held the kind of professional concern that made my throat tighten with dangerous hope. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, perfecting the smile that had become my shield against adult curiosity. "Just had a tumble on the ice during the storms. Daddy says I'm naturally clumsy, that I'll grow out of it eventually." Mrs. Campbell's eyes lingered on the carefully concealed bruises around my wrists, on the way I held my books against my chest, as if protecting myself from some expected blow. Her attention was kindness itself, but kindness had become more dangerous than cruelty in my world. That same week, she offered me extra portions at lunch from her own brown bag, worried about my pale complexion and the weight I'd lost during the winter months. "Growing girls need proper nutrition," she said, pressing a sandwich wrapped in wax paper into my hands. "Especially bright ones like you. But every act of kindness, every concerned glance, every whispered conversation between adults who thought I couldn't hear, only served to increase Frank's paranoia. He'd begun monitoring my interactions more closely, questioning me about conversations at school teachers who took special interest classmates who might serve as confidants. That winter taught me lessons I would carry for the rest of my life. How to set broken bones using makeshift splints and torn cloth. How to treat serious infections with household remedies and veterinary supplies. How to lie convincingly while your body screamed the truth of what had been done to it. Most importantly, I learned that survival required more than just enduring whatever Frank chose to inflict. It demanded strategy, patience, and the absolute certainty that no one was coming to save me. Spring couldn't come fast enough, but when it finally arrived, announced by the first tentative birdsong and the sound of ice breaking up on Mill Creek, it brought new dangers along with its promise of renewal. My changing body had caught Frank's attention in ways that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn with dread. The real horror was just beginning, and I was still months away from understanding the full scope of what he planned for me. The year 1959 brought dust storms that rolled across Iowa like brown tsunamis, walls of earth so thick they turned day into night and left grit in every corner of our house, no matter how tightly we sealed the windows. The drought had returned with biblical vengeance, turning our cornfields into graveyards of withered stalks and our well water into liquid mud. I had learned to navigate Frank's moods like a sailor reading weather patterns,
But the financial pressure of another failed harvest season made him unpredictable in new ways. His drinking intensified, his violence became more calculated, and his interest in my developing body grew from occasional violation to systematic exploitation. The first major escalation came during Millbrook's annual county fair in July. The fairgrounds, normally a celebration of rural Iowa's abundance, had become a showcase of desperation. Farmers displayed stunted vegetables and sickly livestock, their forced smiles unable to hide the worry in their eyes. The dust had been whipping across the grounds all day, turning the air thick and gritty, making everyone irritable and eager to finish their business and get home. I was helping Mrs. Henderson at the 4-H booth, arranging our family's meager contribution, a few scraggly tomatoes, and some preservation jars filled with last year's canned peaches, when Frank appeared at my elbow. He was dressed in civilian clothes, for once jeans and a faded flannel shirt that made him look like any other struggling farmer, instead of the uniformed monster I knew him to be. "Time to head home, Sarah," he announced, his voice loud enough to carry to the other adults working nearby. "Your mother's taken a turn for the worse. She's asking for you." I glanced toward the Methodist church booth, where Mother sat in the shade, chatting weakly with other farm wives about whose gardens had survived the drought. She looked no worse than usual, frail and pale, but alert enough to be social. Frank's lie was so casual, so automatic, that none of the adults questioned it. They saw a devoted father collecting his daughter during a family crisis, nothing more. He guided me away from the crowd, with his hand gripping my upper arm, hard enough to leave fingerprints steering me toward the livestock pens at the far end of the fairgrounds. The cattle lowed restlessly in their stalls, made nervous by the swirling dust and the electric tension that seemed to precede every thunderstorm. Behind the largest barn, hidden from view by rows of prize-winning Holsteins, Frank shoved me against a wooden fence post with enough force to rattle the boards. "I saw you talking to that Patterson boy," he snarled, referring to Dr. Patterson's teenage son Jimmy, who'd been helping judge the livestock competitions. "Saw you smiling at him like some kind of little whore, batting your eyelashes and pushing out that chest of yours." "We were just discussing his calf," I began, but his fist connected with the side of my head before I could finish the explanation. The impact slammed my skull against the rough fence post, and stars exploded across my vision as warm blood began trickling from where the wood had scraped my scalp. "Don't you lie to me," he whispered, his face inches from mine, bourbon and tobacco strong on his breath. "I know exactly what you were thinking. I can see it in the way you look at boys, now the way you walk, the way you hold yourself. You're just like your whore mother can't keep your legs closed for 5 minutes without thinking about what you could get in return." His hands began their familiar exploration of my developing body, ignoring my weak attempts to push him away. The cattle nearby lowed more urgently, as if sensing the violence taking place just feet from their stalls. Through my blurred vision, I could see families enjoying the fair in the distance, children laughing on carnival rides, teenagers sharing cotton candy and stolen kisses. Normal people living normal lives in a world that existed parallel to my nightmare. "Please, Daddy," I whispered, hating myself for begging, but unable to stop the words. "Please, don't do this here. Someone might see." "Don't what?" His voice took on the mock innocent tone he used when he wanted to pretend his violations were expressions of paternal love. "Don't show affection to my daughter. Don't demonstrate how much I care about her development into womanhood. This is just family business, Sarah. Just a father making sure his little girl knows how special she is." The assault that followed left me shaking and nauseous, my dress torn in places that would require careful mending and creative explanations. When it was over, Frank straightened his clothes and ran his fingers through his hair, transforming back into the respected member of the community in a matter of seconds. "Clean yourself up," he commanded, tossing me his handkerchief. "We're going back to enjoy the fair, and you're going to smile and act like the grateful daughter you're supposed to be. One word about what just happened, one hint to anyone that anything occurred, and your mother dies tonight. I'll make it look like her tuberculosis complications finally overwhelmed her weakened system. Who's going to question a deputy sheriff's medical assessment of natural causes?
We walked back through the fairgrounds together, his arm draped around my shoulders in a display of paternal affection that made my stomach turn. People smiled at us, commented on what a devoted father he was, how lucky I was to have such a protective parent who never let me out of his sight. The second major incident happened 3 weeks later, during a tornado warning that sent everyone in the county scrambling for their basement shelters. The emergency sirens had been wailing for 20 minutes, and the radio crackled with updates about a massive supercell system moving across central Iowa, spawning funnels that had already destroyed 2 farmsteads south of us. Our basement was cramped and musty, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed electrical cord. The stone walls sweated constantly, and the air smelled of mildew and the potatoes we stored in wooden crates along the far wall. Mother huddled in the corner, her coughing worse in the damp environment, while the emergency radio provided a steady stream of increasingly dire weather updates. Frank had been drinking steadily since the first siren sounded his nerves, frayed not by the approaching storm, but by the mounting pressure of another failed harvest and the bank loans that would come due in the fall. When the radio announcer reported that a confirmed tornado had touched down just 10 miles south of our location, Frank turned to me with that familiar predatory gleam in his pale eyes. "Come here, Sarah," he said softly, patting his lap the way he had when I was small and innocent, and didn't understand what his touches meant or where they would lead. I glanced desperately at Mother, hoping for intervention, or at least witness to what was about to happen, but she was lost in her own world of pain medication and fever dreams. The storm raged overhead with increasing fury, rattling our house on its foundation and providing perfect acoustic cover for whatever Frank had planned. "I said, come here!" The threat underlying his quiet voice made my knees weak with terror. He pulled me onto his lap, with hands that brooked no resistance, and immediately began the exploration that had become routine in our household. But this time was different, more aggressive, more invasive, more explicitly sexual in its intent. His breathing grew heavy against my ear as he whispered detailed promises of what he would do to me when Mother finally died and left us alone together in the house. I tried to fight back, clawing at his arms, with fingernails bitten down to the quick, but he was too strong, and my struggles only seemed to excite him further. It was only when the all-clear siren finally sounded and Mother began to stir from her semi-conscious state that he finally released me, pushing me away like something contaminated. "Go check the house for storm damage," he ordered, his voice perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened. "Make sure none of the windows got blown out." I stumbled up the basement stairs on shaking legs, my mind reeling from the realization that these attacks were not only escalating in frequency, but also in severity. Outside, the world looked deceptively normal. A few broken tree branches scattered across our yard, some scattered debris from the neighbor's barn. Other families emerging from their own shelters to assess whatever damage the storm had inflicted. But inside our house, something fundamental had been shattered that could never be repaired. The pretense that Frank's violations were somehow expressions of paternal affection had been abandoned entirely. What remained was raw predation, and I was running out of time to find a way to escape it. That night, lying in my narrow bed, listening to Frank's heavy breathing from across the hall, I made the decision that would define the next phase of my survival. I couldn't continue enduring this alone, couldn't keep absorbing his escalating violence without eventually breaking completely. I needed help, even if seeking it meant risking everything. I'd heard whispers over the years about my Aunt Clara Mother's sister, who lived in Des Moines and worked as a secretary for an insurance company. Christmas cards arrived every year, always signed with love, and an open invitation to visit anytime you need a change of scenery. The cards were carefully neutral, but something in the precise handwriting suggested a woman who paid attention to details others might miss. My plan began to form as the summer heat settled over our failing farm like a suffocating blanket. I would find a way to contact Clara directly, bypassing Frank's scrutiny of our mail. I would arrange to meet her somehow, somewhere outside his sphere of control. I would tell her the truth about what was happening in our house and beg her to help me escape before Frank's violence escalated to its inevitable conclusion. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have suspected, was that Frank had been reading Mother's correspondence for years, intercepting letters, monitoring every potential avenue of outside contact, building a wall of isolation around us that was far more complete than I had realized. My carefully laid plans were walking straight into a trap that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and my very identity. The threads were tightening around my throat, and I didn't even realize I was already caught in a web that had been 20 years in the making. The discovery that would change everything came on a suffocating August night in 1960, 3 days after my 15th birthday. Frank had left for what he claimed was a late patrol shift, but I'd seen him meeting with other men behind Morrison's general store earlier that day, men whose business had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with the bootlegging operation that supplemented his deputy's salary. Mother was heavily sedated, lost in the morphine haze that Dr. Patterson now prescribed, in increasingly generous doses to ease what everyone understood were her final months. The tuberculosis had spread to her bones, and some nights I could hear her whimpering in her sleep as the disease consumed her from the inside out. This was my chance, perhaps my only chance, to search for information about Aunt Clara that might help me plan my escape. I needed an address, a telephone number, some way to contact her directly without Frank's knowledge. I crept into Frank's bedroom on bare feet, my heart hammering against my ribs with every creak of our old house. His desk sat in the far corner, a massive oak piece that had belonged to his father locked tight with a brass key he thought he'd hidden well behind a loose brick in our kitchen fireplace. The desk drawers opened with soft clicks that sounded thunderous in the midnight silence. The first drawer contained his official paperwork arrest reports, citation books, duty rosters, the bureaucratic detritus of small-town law enforcement. But the second drawer held something that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. Letters, dozens of them tied with a faded blue ribbon that had once been white, all addressed to Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison in careful feminine handwriting. The return address read, Clara Henley, Des Moines, Iowa. But these weren't recent letters asking about Mother's health or extending invitations for holiday visits. These were old. The postmarks dated back to 1945, years before I was born, years when Frank was serving overseas in the Pacific Theater, and Mother was alone on the farm, struggling to keep our land from being foreclosed by the bank. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon and opened the first envelope. The paper was thin and yellowed with age, crackling softly as I unfolded it in the dim light from Frank's bedside lamp. Clara's handwriting was neat and precise, each word formed with the careful attention of someone who understood that written communications might someday serve as evidence. Dearest Elizabeth, I received your letter about Thomas and want you to know that I don't judge you for what happened during Frank's deployment. War makes people desperate for comfort, makes them seek solace wherever they can find it. But you must tell Frank the truth about Sarah's father before this deception causes more pain than it prevents. That poor child deserves to know who she really is. The words hit me like physical blows. Sarah's father. The room seemed to tilt around me as I reached for another letter dated 6 months later. Elizabeth, Frank's drinking has gotten worse according to your last letter, and I'm worried about what you've told me regarding his treatment of Sarah. Have you considered that his anger toward her might be directly connected to his knowledge of her true parentage? Men's pride is a fragile thing, especially when they discover their wives have been unfaithful. If you won't tell Sarah the truth about her father, then perhaps she has a right to know that Thomas Kellerman's blood runs in her veins, not Frank Morrison's. Thomas Kellerman. The names swam before my eyes as I reached for more letters, each one painting a clearer picture of a secret that had poisoned my entire existence. Thomas Kellerman, a traveling salesman who had stayed in our town for 3 months during the brutal winter of 1944, while Frank served his country in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Mother, lonely and desperate and convinced her husband was dead, had found comfort in the arms of a stranger who promised her that everything would be all right. I was the living evidence of that wartime affair, born exactly 9 months after Thomas left Millbrook for good, never knowing he was leaving behind a child who would pay for her parents' moment of desperate comfort with a lifetime of abuse. The final letter in the bundle was different from the others written in Frank's harsh, angular handwriting on official sheriff's department stationery. Never sent, probably never intended to be sent, but preserved as some kind of twisted memento of his rage. Clara, you sanctimonious bitch! You think I don't know what that child really is? You think I'm blind to the timeline, too stupid to count months and add numbers? Elizabeth's bastard will never be my daughter, but she'll serve her purpose in this house. She'll pay for her mother's sins every day of her miserable life until I decide she's paid enough. And if you ever try to contact her directly, if you ever attempt to fill her head with ideas about her real father, I'll make sure you regret it for whatever short time you have left on this earth. The paper scattered from my nerveless fingers as the full horror of my situation crashed over me like a physical weight. Frank had known all along. Every beating, every sexual assault, every moment of calculated cruelty, all of it had been revenge against my mother, with me serving as the convenient target for his rage. Every "you're worthless," every "you'll never amount to anything," every violation of my body and spirit had been Frank's way of punishing Elizabeth Morrison for her wartime indiscretion. I wasn't his daughter being disciplined, I was Thomas Kellerman's bastard being tortured for the crime of existing. But the revelation brought something else with it, something I hadn't expected, a strange sense of liberation. I wasn't Frank Morrison's daughter. His diseased blood didn't flow through my veins. The shame I'd carried, the self-loathing that whispered I somehow deserved his treatment because I was part of him, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. The sound of automobile tires on gravel sent me into a panic. Frank was returning early from his clandestine meeting, his headlights sweeping across the bedroom windows as he pulled into our driveway. I shoved the letters back into their drawer, my hands shaking so violently I could barely manage the lock. By the time his boots hit our front porch, I was back in my bedroom, fully dressed beneath my covers, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. I heard him pause outside my door longer than usual, and I wondered with sick terror if he somehow sensed that I had discovered his secret. But he finally moved on to his own room, and I lay in the darkness processing everything I had learned. The knowledge was dangerous. If Frank ever discovered that I knew the truth about my parentage, there would be no limit to his retaliation. But it was also powerful, more powerful than anything I had ever possessed in my 15 years of life. For the first time, I understood that Frank's treatment of me had nothing to do with my failures or inadequacies as a daughter. It was about his own weakness, his inability to forgive his wife's moment of wartime desperation, his need to punish someone for the humiliation of raising another man's child. The next morning brought thunderstorms that seemed to mirror the chaos in my mind. As I served Frank his breakfast eggs over easy black coffee, 2 pieces of toast with butter, the same meal he ate every morning of his life, I studied his face with new eyes. He looked smaller, somehow more pathetic. The badge on his chest that commanded respect throughout Millbrook County was just costume jewelry adorning a bitter, broken man who had built his entire identity around a lie. "You're quiet this morning," he observed, cutting into his eggs with mechanical precision. "Just tired," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline racing through my system like electricity. He grunted and returned to his meal, but I caught him watching me in his peripheral vision. Frank had always been paranoid about maintaining the fiction that held his world together, but now I understood why. He was protecting more than just his reputation.
He was protecting his sanity, the delicate balance of lies that allowed him to see himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own misery. That knowledge would become my weapon, though I didn't yet understand how to use it. All I knew was that everything had changed in the space of one stolen hour with a handful of yellowed letters. I wasn't Frank Morrison's daughter. I was Sarah Kellerman, child of a traveling salesman and a lonely woman who had made one desperate choice during the darkest days of World War II. The storm outside intensified, rattling our windows and flooding the low places in our fields. I watched the water rise in our backyard, thinking about Thomas Kellerman, wondering if he was still alive somewhere, if he had ever wondered about the child he had unknowingly left behind in Iowa. Probably not. Men like that were experts at moving on, at leaving their complications scattered across the Midwest like discarded newspapers. But I was no longer his mistake, or mother's shame, or Frank's victim. I was Sarah Kellerman, and I had a father's name to claim, a truth to hold on to, and a future to fight for. The escape I had been planning suddenly became more than just survival. It became the reclamation of an identity that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to understand its value. The game had changed completely, and for the first time in my life, I held cards that Frank Morrison didn't know I possessed. Armed with the devastating truth about my parentage, I began planning my escape with the focused determination of someone who finally understood what she was fighting for. At 16, during the spring of 1961, I managed to make contact with Aunt Clara through a carefully worded letter mailed from the post office in Cedar Falls, 20 miles from Millbrook. Her response arrived within 2 weeks, hidden between the pages of a ladies' home journal I had ordered to Morrison's general store, under the pretense of wanting to learn better homemaking skills. Sarah, I have been waiting for you to reach out for years. Come to Des Moines as soon as you safely can. I have a small apartment with an extra room and a job waiting for you at the insurance office where I work. Your mother's condition is beyond any help that modern medicine can provide, but you still have a chance at a real life. The enclosed money should be enough for a bus ticket and some new clothes. All my love and hope, Aunt Clara. The 5 $20 bills tucked inside the magazine represented more money than I had ever seen at one time freedom bought and paid for, by a woman I barely remembered, but who had never forgotten me. I hid the money in the lining of my old suitcase and began gathering the few possessions I could carry: some clothes, mother's wedding ring, which I planned to leave with Clara for safekeeping, and the letters I had stolen from Frank's desk as evidence of his knowledge and deception. My escape was carefully planned for a Saturday in early June, when Frank would be working a double shift covering for a sick colleague. I had checked his duty roster, confirmed his whereabouts with the dispatcher, and memorized the bus schedule to Des Moines. Everything was perfect except for the crisis that changed everything. Mother collapsed in our kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while I was helping her walk to the bathroom. One moment she was upright, leaning heavily on my shoulder. The next, she was on the floor with blood streaming from her mouth and her body convulsing in ways that terrified me. I called Dr. Patterson immediately, and he arrived within 20 minutes, his face grave as he examined her prone form.
"It's her lungs," he explained quietly while we waited for the ambulance he had summoned. "The tuberculosis has spread throughout her respiratory system. She needs more intensive care than I can provide here at home." Frank arrived just as the ambulance attendants were loading Mother onto a stretcher, his face a perfect mask of concern and devotion. But beneath the performance, I caught something else in his expression: calculation. Mother in the hospital meant we would be alone in the house together with no witnesses to whatever he decided to do. The next 3 days passed in a nightmare of hospital visits and mounting tension. Mother drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing us, sometimes lost in fevered dreams where she spoke to people who had been dead for decades. Frank played the devoted husband with Academy Award-worthy skill, bringing flowers, speaking in hushed tones, with the nurses accepting condolences from well-meaning neighbors who stopped by to offer their support. But at home, with no audience to perform for, his mask slipped completely. She's going to die," he told me on the third night, his words slurred by the bourbon he had been consuming steadily since we returned from our evening hospital visit. Could be tomorrow, could be next week, but she's going to die. And then it'll just be you and me in this house, Sarah. Just the two of us with no one to interrupt our private family time. I tried to edge toward the kitchen door, but Frank moved faster than his intoxicated state should have allowed, blocking my escape route. Our kitchen suddenly felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in around us like the sides of a coffin.
Where do you think you're going? He asked, swaying slightly but still dangerously alert. We need to discuss the future, our future together.
His hands found my shoulders, gripping them with painful pressure. I've been thinking about what comes next after your mother finally stops lingering and dies like she should have years ago. There won't be any reason to be discreet anymore. We can be a real family, then a proper family, where the daughter takes care of all her daddy's needs. The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was talking about something permanent, something that would trap me in this house forever, as his victim, his surrogate wife, his possession. The bus ticket to Des Moines and Clara's loving invitation suddenly seemed as distant as the moon. I tried to run then, but Frank's reflexes were still sharp despite the alcohol. He caught me at the kitchen door, slamming me against the wood with enough force to rattle the windows. My head struck the doorframe, and stars exploded across my vision as the familiar taste of blood filled my mouth.
No running,
he whispered against my ear, his breath hot and sour with bourbon.
Not anymore. Not ever again. You're mine now, Sarah. You've always been mine, but soon it'll be legal and proper.
The assault that followed was the most violent yet fueled by alcohol and the approaching end of his charade as a grieving husband. When it was over, I lay on our kitchen floor with my dress torn and my body aching while Frank adjusted his clothes and poured himself another drink as if nothing had happened.
Clean yourself up, he commanded with the casual authority he used on suspects in his jail cell. We're going to visit your mother in the morning, and I want you looking presentable. No one likes to see a sloppy girl at a sickbed.
That night, I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and understanding with absolute clarity that my window for escape was closing rapidly. Mother was dying. Frank's control over me was tightening like a noose, and I was running out of options that didn't end with my own death or complete subjugation to his will. The final crisis came at 3:17 in the morning on June 15th, 1961. The hospital called to tell us that Mother had taken a severe turn for the worse and that we should come immediately if we wanted to say goodbye. Frank roused me from sleep, and we drove through the dark Iowa countryside in his patrol car, neither of us speaking during the 20-minute journey that felt like hours. We arrived to find Dr. Patterson waiting in the hospital corridor, his face carrying the weight of news he'd delivered too many times before.
She's asking for both of you, he said quietly. It won't be very long now.
Mother died at 4:17 a.m. Her last breath, a soft sigh that seemed to carry away all the pain she had endured over the long years of her illness. Frank held her hand and wept with convincing grief, the devoted husband mourning his beloved wife. I stood at the foot of her hospital bed, dry-eyed and numb, understanding that my last protection had just slipped away forever. Dr. Patterson's dilemma, later that same morning alone in his office above the pharmacy. Dr. Patterson sat reviewing Sarah Morrison's medical files, a thick folder that had grown steadily over the past 8 years. Page after page documented a pattern that made his stomach turn bruises that didn't match the explanations given, fractures that suggested deliberate violence rather than childhood accidents, behavioral changes consistent with severe trauma.
I should have done something years ago,
he whispered to himself, spreading the photographs he'd taken across his desk like evidence in a court case.
I should have been braver.
His wife Margaret found him there an hour later, slumped over his desk with his head in his hands.
Oh, that poor Morrison girl, he said without looking up. I've been documenting Frank's abuse for years, building a case file, but I never had the courage to act on it. Now her mother's dead, and God knows what he'll do to her.
Margaret Patterson had been married to a country doctor long enough to recognize the weight of moral choices her husband carried.
You can't save every patient, David. Sometimes the system fails and good people get hurt.
But I had evidence. Dr. Patterson replied, his voice thick with self-recrimination. I had photographs, medical records, documentation that would have convinced any reasonable judge. I was just too afraid of Frank Morrison's badge, too worried about my own reputation to do what needed to be done.
The funeral was held 3 days later, a small service attended by most of Millbrook's population. Frank accepted condolences with appropriate dignity, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that everyone interpreted as paternal comfort.
But I could feel the proprietary pressure of his fingers, the subtle message that I now belonged to him completely and utterly. Clara sent flowers and a sympathy card, but she didn't attend the funeral.
Too far to travel on such short notice, Frank explained to anyone who asked about the absence of Mother's only surviving relative. What he didn't mention was the telegram he had sent signed with my name, telling Clara that I had changed my mind about leaving home and asking her not to contact me anymore. I only learned about this deception months later, when it was far too late to matter. By then, Clara had given up trying to reach me, believing that I had chosen to stay with Frank willingly. The lifeline I had counted on was severed with surgical precision, leaving me completely isolated with the man who had tormented me for years and was now free to escalate his abuse without any fear of discovery or intervention. The last obstacle to Frank Morrison's complete dominance over my life was my own unwillingness to surrender entirely. But at 16 years old, alone and trapped in rural Iowa with a corrupt deputy sheriff who held absolute power over my existence, resistance seemed increasingly futile. The real test of my survival instincts was about to begin, and I was rapidly running out of time to find a way to save myself. 4 years passed in a blur of escalating abuse and carefully concealed survival strategies. By October 1965, I was 20 years old and had become expert at hiding bruises, explaining away injuries, and maintaining the fiction that Frank Morrison was my devoted father rather than my captor and tormentor. The outside world saw a young woman who had chosen to care for her widowed father instead of seeking her own life, a noble sacrifice that earned their approval and provided Frank with perfect protection from scrutiny. Church ladies would pat my hand and tell me what a good daughter I was. Store clerks would comment on how devoted Frank and I seemed to each other. Even Dr. Patterson, despite his years of documented suspicions, had been lulled into believing that I had simply accepted my fate. The truth was far darker and more complex. With Mother dead and no witnesses to his behavior, Frank had transformed our isolated farmhouse into his private kingdom of sexual abuse and psychological torture. The violations were routine, now often accompanied by detailed threats about what happened to runaway girls who were found dead in roadside ditches, victims of unknown assailants whose cases were quietly closed without investigation. "That could be you," he would whisper after particularly brutal attacks, his voice still heavy with postcoital satisfaction. "Just another unfortunate girl who thought she could make it on her own in a dangerous world. The roads around here are treacherous for pretty young things traveling alone after dark." But I had learned patience during those 4 years, and I had learned strategic planning. The truth about my parentage had given me something precious, the knowledge that Frank's power over me was built entirely on lies and maintained through fear. I had begun keeping a detailed journal hidden in our barn, documenting his abuse with dates and descriptions that might someday serve as evidence in a court of law. More importantly, I had been saving money with the methodical determination of someone planning for a single chance at freedom. Coins lifted from Frank's wallet when he was drunk, and unconscious bills skimmed from grocery money over months of careful budgeting tips earned from occasional waitressing work at the diner in town. It all went into a coffee can buried behind our chicken coop. The escape attempt came on a rain-soaked October night, when Frank was supposedly working a late patrol shift. I had checked his duty roster, called the station, with a fabricated question to confirm his whereabouts, and prepared my route to the Greyhound station in Cedar Rapids. My plan was meticulous accounting for every variable I could anticipate. Everything was perfectly orchestrated except for the trap that Frank Morrison had been laying for months in advance. He was waiting for me on that deserted stretch of County Road 47, his patrol car positioned to completely block the narrow asphalt strip that served as my only escape route. The red and blue emergency lights cut through the rain like colored knives as I slowed my old Ford pickup, my heart sinking, as I realized the full scope of his preparation and foresight. This wasn't a chance encounter or a lucky guess on his part. This was a carefully orchestrated confrontation, the culmination of months of surveillance and planning that I had been too naive to recognize.
"Well, well, well," Frank said as he approached my driver's side window, his flashlight beam dancing across my face with deliberate malice. "If it isn't my dear daughter Sarah out for a midnight drive in this terrible weather. Where exactly might you be headed at this ungodly hour?" I tried to maintain the pretense, but my voice shook with barely controlled terror. "I couldn't sleep, Daddy. The storm was keeping me awake. I thought maybe a drive would help clear my head." Frank's laugh was harsh and utterly without humor. "With a suitcase packed in the back seat and all your carefully hoarded savings tucked into that old purse of your mother's. That's quite a lot of preparation for a simple insomnia cure, don't you think?" The realization that he had been monitoring my preparations for months, possibly years, hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Every careful plan, every hidden dollar, every secret hope he had known about all of it. The game had been rigged from the very beginning, and I had been playing it like a naive child. "Get out of the car, Sarah." His voice carried all the authority of his badge, but underneath I could hear something else: anticipation. He had been looking forward to this moment, savoring it in advance like a fine wine. I complied slowly, the cold October rain immediately soaking through my thin dress and chilling me to the bone. The air smelled of wet earth and approaching winter, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the Iowa plains like artillery fire. "You disappoint me," Frank said conversationally, as if we were discussing nothing more significant than the weather or crop prices. "After everything I've done for you, all the care and guidance I've provided over the years, this is how you choose to repay my generosity, by running away like some ungrateful little whore who doesn't appreciate what she has." His first blow caught me across the face with enough force to split my lip and send me stumbling backward toward the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. I landed hard on my knees, the sharp gravel biting through my stockings and into my skin, tasting blood, as I looked up at the man who had tormented me for most of my life. "Did you really think you could escape me?" he asked, advancing with the deliberate steps of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere left to run. "Did you honestly believe I was so stupid, so unobservant, that I wouldn't notice you scheming and plotting behind my back?" The nightstick appeared in his hand, the same weapon he used to maintain order among Millbrook's rare troublemakers. But tonight, there would be no order, only the chaos of years of suppressed rage finally finding its target. "This is what happens to ungrateful daughters." He snarled the first blow, catching me across the shoulders and driving me face first into the muddy gravel. "This is what happens to little whores who think they can abandon their responsibilities and run off to play at being independent women." The beating that followed was systematic and brutal, delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned exactly how much damage the human body could absorb while remaining conscious and aware. Frank had abandoned all pretense of leaving marks that could be explained away tonight. He wasn't planning to let me live long enough for anyone to ask questions. When he finally tired of using the nightstick, Frank's assault took on a different character entirely. This wasn't the familiar violation I had endured hundreds of times over the years. This was something final, something that felt like a farewell to a relationship that had defined both our lives in the most twisted possible way. "You know too much," he whispered as he pinned me against the cold metal of his patrol car, his breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of excitement rather than exertion. About me, about your real father, about all the dirty little secrets that could ruin my reputation in this county. I can't let you leave here alive, Sarah. I can't let you spread your poison around town. But something in his voice, some note of uncertainty or need for validation, made me find words despite the pain. You mean about Thomas Kellerman? About the truth you've been hiding all these years? Frank froze in the middle of his assault, his face contorting with shock and rage. Where could you possibly have? I found the letters. I gasped out, seizing on the one weapon I had left. All of them. Clara's letters to Mother. Your letter that you never sent. I know everything about Thomas Kellerman and what happened during the war. His hand found my throat, squeezing with enough pressure to make spots dance before my eyes. You little bitch! You've been going through my private things, reading my personal correspondence. How long have you known? Years. I lied, understanding instinctively that knowledge was my only remaining currency. I've known for years that you're not my real father, that you've been torturing me because you couldn't forgive Mother for her affair. Frank's grip tightened, and I felt consciousness beginning to fade around the edges. Then, you understand why I can't let you live. Can't let you walk around this county spreading stories about Frank Morrison, the respected deputy sheriff, who spent 15 years raising another man's bastard child. Do you have any idea what that would do to my reputation? My standing in this community? Everyone already suspects, I whispered, playing my last desperate card. Dr. Patterson has been documenting your abuse for years. Mrs. Campbell has records of my injuries going back to elementary school. You think people are blind? You think they don't notice a girl who flinches every time an adult raises their voice? The fear that flashed across Frank's features was worth every moment of pain I had endured to see it. For the first time in our relationship, he was the one who was afraid, the one who understood that his carefully constructed world of lies was more fragile than he had realized. That moment of uncertainty was all I needed. My knee found his groin with every ounce of strength I had left, and his grunt of surprised agony was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Frank stumbled backward, momentarily stunned by the unexpected resistance, and I seized my chance. The muddy ground made footing treacherous, but I ran toward the swollen creek that paralleled the road, hoping that darkness and the storm would hide me long enough to escape. Behind me, I could hear Frank cursing and fumbling for his service weapon, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of rain and thunder. Sarah, come back here right now. You can't hide from me forever. You little bitch. When I find you, and I will find you, you're going to pay for every moment of trouble you've caused me. The creek was higher than I had ever seen it, transformed by days of heavy rain into a raging torrent that carried debris from upstream farms and threatened to overflow its banks. Under normal circumstances, I would never have attempted to cross it, especially not in the dark and in my current condition. But with Frank's footsteps growing closer and his flashlight beam sweeping the darkness behind me like a malevolent lighthouse, I had no choice. I plunged into the icy water, immediately swept off my feet by a current that was far stronger than I had anticipated. The creek carried me downstream faster than I could have run, my waterlogged dress tangling around my legs as I fought desperately to keep my head above the surface. Trees and fence posts and pieces of barn siding rushed past me in the darkness, and I grabbed frantically at anything that might arrest my wild ride toward the river. My salvation came in the unlikely form of a fallen oak tree that had created a natural dam across a narrow section of the creek about a mile downstream from where I had entered the water. I managed to catch hold of its branches and drag myself partially out of the torrent, gasping and shivering as I tried to orient myself in the storm-black landscape.
I could no longer hear Frank's voice over the sound of rushing water and thunder, and his flashlight was nowhere to be seen. The current had carried me far enough from the road that even his patrol car's spotlight wouldn't be able to find me among the flooded bottomland. The rest of that endless night passed in a blur of cold and pain and desperate determination. I made my way slowly toward the lights of Millbrook, following fence lines and avoiding the roads where Frank's patrol car might be searching for my broken body. My injuries from the beating made every step an agony, but adrenaline and the knowledge that my life depended on reaching help kept me moving. Dawn found me collapsed on the front steps of Dr. Patterson's house, hypothermic and barely conscious, my dress torn, and my body bearing the unmistakable evidence of Frank Morrison's final assault. The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of his front door opening and his shocked exclamation as he discovered what the storm had washed up on his doorstep. When I woke up, I was in the county hospital, my body wrapped in warm blankets and connected to an intravenous drip. Dr. Patterson sat beside my bed, his face grave as he made notes on a clipboard. But something in his expression had changed since our last encounter. This wasn't the cautious country doctor who had spent years documenting abuse without acting on his suspicions. This was a man who had finally decided that enough was enough. "Sarah," he said gently when he saw my eyes open. "You're safe now. Can you tell me exactly what happened to you last night?"
For the first time in my 20 years of life, I told the truth, all of it, without reservation or fear of the consequences. The years of systematic abuse, the sexual assaults that had become routine, my escape attempt, and Frank's explicit promise to kill me rather than allow me to expose his crimes to the world. Dr. Patterson listened without interruption, his pen moving steadily across the paper as he documented every detail of my testimony. When I finished, he set down his clipboard and looked at me with eyes that held both compassion and determination.
"We're going to need more than just your word," he said quietly. "We'll need photographs of your injuries, medical documentation that can stand up in court, witness statements from anyone who might have suspected what was happening. Are you prepared to fight this battle, Sarah? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back to the way things were."
I nodded without hesitation, understanding that this was my moment of final choice. I could retreat back into silence and accept whatever fate Frank Morrison had planned for me, or I could stand up and fight for the life that had been stolen from me piece by piece over the course of 20 years.
I'm ready," I whispered, and for the first time in my life, I truly meant it.
The war for my freedom was about to begin, and I was no longer fighting alone. The investigation begins. The weeks following my escape transformed my life from a private nightmare into a very public battleground. Dr. Patterson's documentation of my injuries was thorough and professionally devastating. Multiple fractured ribs from the nightstick beating, extensive bruising consistent with sexual assault, severe lacerations from gravel that would leave permanent scars, and clear signs of hypothermia from my desperate flight through the flooded creek. The photographs he took were clinical but damning, creating an undeniable visual record of Frank Morrison's brutality. More importantly, Dr. Patterson finally opened his files to investigators, revealing 8 years of careful documentation that painted an unmistakable picture of systematic abuse. I should have acted sooner, he confessed to me during one of our sessions. I've been building a case file for years, but I was afraid of Frank's connections, worried about challenging someone with a badge. I failed you, Sarah, and I'll spend the rest of my career trying to make up for that cowardice. Mrs. Campbell's testimony. The first major breakthrough came when Mrs. Campbell, my former elementary school teacher, volunteered to testify about what she had observed over the years. She appeared at my hospital bedside, carrying a worn manila folder filled with handwritten notes. "I documented everything," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "Every unexplained absence, every visible injury, every time you flinched when someone raised their voice. I kept telling myself it wasn't enough evidence to act on, but the truth is,
I was just afraid of Frank Morrison.
Her classroom records were devastating in their accumulated detail.
September 15th, 1955. Sarah absent Monday, Tuesday, following weekend. Visible finger marks on upper arms when she returned. Claims she fell helping with farm chores, but marks are inconsistent with that explanation. October 3rd, 1956. Sarah, struggling to concentrate, jumps at sudden noises, eating very little at lunch. When asked if everything is okay at home, insists she's just naturally nervous, but won't make eye contact. March 12th, 1957. Sarah arrived at school with split lip and swollen jaw. Father's story about walking into a door doesn't match injury pattern. Child exhibits classic signs of trauma but refuses to discuss home situation. Page after page, year after year, the pattern was undeniable. Mrs. Campbell's careful observations provided the historical context that investigators needed to understand the scope of Frank's abuse. I tried to help in small ways. She continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Extra food at lunch, gentle questions staying after school to give you a safe place to be for a few more hours each day. But I should have been braver. I should have risked my position to protect you. As word of the investigation spread through Millbrook, other witnesses emerged from the shadows, people who had seen pieces of the truth but had never connected them into a complete picture. Betty Jenkins, the postal clerk, provided crucial testimony about Frank's control over our mail. He'd come in regular as clockwork, always asking if there was correspondence for Sarah, always taking it to save her the trip. Now I realize he was isolating her, cutting off any potential sources of help or outside contact. Tom Bradley, the mechanic who serviced our vehicles, documented a suspicious pattern of damage. That girl's car was in my shop every few months for repairs that didn't match her explanations. Dented fenders, she claimed, came from backing into posts. Cracked windshields, she said, were caused by flying rocks. The damage patterns suggested deliberate violence, but Frank always backed up her stories. Even Reverend Walsh, the Lutheran pastor, admitted to harboring suspicions. There was something wrong in that family, something that made my skin crawl during home visits. Frank's possessiveness toward Sarah, the way she shrank away from physical contact, Elizabeth's obvious terror whenever her husband was in the room. I prayed about it, but I never took action. May God forgive me for my cowardice. But Frank Morrison wasn't passive during this process. His response was swift, vicious, and designed to destroy my credibility before the investigation could gain serious momentum. He hired an expensive criminal defense attorney from Chicago, a man who specialized in defending law enforcement officers accused of misconduct. The strategy was predictable, but effective. Attack my mental stability, minimize the medical evidence, and portray Frank as a dedicated public servant being destroyed by the vindictive lies of a disturbed young woman who had never properly grieved her mother's death. Stories began circulating through Millbrook about my supposed history of making up stories for attention. My ungrateful behavior toward the man who had sacrificed everything to raise me after mother's death. Anonymous rumors suggested that I had always been troubled, prone to self-injury and elaborate fantasies designed to get sympathy from adults. That girl's always been a problem, I heard whispered in the grocery store aisles. Frank Morrison is a saint for putting up with her lies and dramatics all these years. Now she's trying to destroy him just because he finally put his foot down about her wild behavior. Frank's supporters in the sheriff's department initially rallied around him, presenting a united front against what they characterized as a malicious prosecution of one of their most respected officers. The badge still carried tremendous weight in rural Iowa, and many people found it easier to believe that a mentally unstable young woman was lying than to accept that a decorated lawman could be capable of such systematic brutality. The tide began to turn when state investigators, responding to pressure from Dr. Patterson and the county prosecutor, ordered comprehensive laboratory analysis of evidence collected from the crime scene and my medical examination. Blood samples revealed traces of chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative that Frank had been stealing from the sheriff's department evidence locker for years. This discovery prompted a much wider investigation into Frank's activities as a law enforcement officer. Internal affairs investigators from the state police began reviewing his cases, systematically looking for patterns of misconduct
and abuse of power. What they found was even more damaging than my personal testimony.
Frank Morrison had been operating his own private kingdom of corruption for over a decade. Evidence lockers showed significant discrepancies, drugs and money from arrests that had mysteriously vanished before reaching court. His arrest reports contained obvious fabrications, domestic violence calls that had been deliberately mishandled to protect his drinking buddies and poker partners. Most damning of all was the testimony of his former partner, Deputy Robert Chen, who finally found the courage to break the blue wall of silence that had protected Frank for so many years. I witnessed Frank's brutality firsthand during domestic disturbance calls. Bob Chen testified during his deposition, his hands shaking as he spoke. He would beat suspects unconscious for minor infractions, then file reports claiming they had violently resisted arrest. When I questioned his methods, he made it clear what would happen to officers who didn't support him completely.
Chen's testimony opened the floodgates. Other officers, freed from fear of retaliation, began coming forward with their own stories of Frank's abuse of power. The picture that emerged was of a man who had used his badge as a hunting license, terrorizing anyone who dared to question his authority or threaten his carefully constructed public image. My personal recovery remained slow and difficult. The physical injuries healed relatively quickly, but the psychological damage ran deeper than any medical treatment could address. Nightmares plagued my sleep, flashbacks disrupted my days, and the simple act of trusting another human being felt impossibly dangerous. Help came from an unexpected source, a support group for abuse survivors that had recently formed in Des Moines, part of the growing women's rights movement that was beginning to challenge society's traditional acceptance of domestic violence. The group was led by Janet Morrison, no relation to Frank, despite the shared surname, a social worker who had survived her own abusive marriage and had dedicated her life to helping other women find their strength. Healing isn't a destination, Janet told me during my first group meeting held in the basement of a Unitarian church. It's a journey, and everyone's path looks different. But the most important thing to understand is that you don't have to walk it alone anymore. The women in that circle had endured horrors similar to mine, and their stories helped me understand that Frank's abuse hadn't defined my worth as a human being. I wasn't damaged goods or used merchandise, despite what his whispered threats had conditioned me to believe over the years. "You survived?" said Margaret, a farmer's wife, whose husband had beaten her unconscious with a tire iron before she found the courage to leave. "That makes you stronger than you know. Survival itself is a form of victory."
Through weekly sessions, I began to understand the psychological mechanisms Frank had used to maintain control over me. Isolation, gaslighting, the systematic destruction of my self-worth, and the cultivation of learned helplessness that had convinced me escape was impossible.
As winter turned to spring, the legal proceedings moved forward with agonizing slowness. Frank's expensive attorney employed every delay tactic in the book-filing motion after motion to suppress evidence, challenge witness testimony, and postpone trial dates.
The civil lawsuit I filed against the sheriff's department was settled out of court for a substantial sum, enough money to ensure my financial independence for years to come. More important than the monetary settlement was the symbolic victory it represented: official acknowledgement that the system had failed to protect me and a commitment to institutional reforms that would prevent similar cases in the future. But the criminal case was more complex and politically sensitive. Frank Morrison still had powerful allies in Iowa law enforcement circles, men who viewed any attack on one of their own as a threat to their entire profession. The turning point came during Frank's own deposition, when his attorney made the tactical error of allowing his client to speak freely about his relationship with me. Frank's narcissism and pathological need to control every narrative led him to make statements that completely contradicted his earlier claims of innocence. "I disciplined her when it was necessary," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he had used during all those years of abuse. Sarah was a difficult child, prone to lying and attention-seeking behavior. Sometimes firm correction was required to keep her in line, to teach her respect for authority.
When pressed for specifics about this firm correction, Frank described punishment methods that constituted clear abuse even by the relaxed standards of 1960s child-rearing. His admission that he had regularly used physical discipline to modify my behavior provided the prosecution with exactly the ammunition they needed to demolish his defense. Frank Morrison was stripped of his badge and pension in March 1966, pending the outcome of his criminal trial. The man who had terrorized Millbrook County for over a decade was suddenly just another defendant in an orange jumpsuit, his fall from grace swift and complete. The criminal charges he faced were extensive multiple counts of sexual assault, child abuse, official corruption evidence, tampering, and conspiracy. Each count carried significant prison time, and the prosecution made it clear they intended to seek the maximum sentence allowed by law. But even as justice moved closer, the price of my victory was becoming clear. The publicity surrounding the case made it impossible for me to remain in Iowa, where I would forever be known as the girl who accused Deputy Morrison. The life I had dreamed of building in my hometown, the normal existence I had fantasized about during all those years of abuse, was no longer possible. It was time to leave Millbrook behind forever, to find a place where I could define myself by my future rather than my past. The settlement money would give me that opportunity, but first, I had one more ghost to lay to rest, one more piece of my identity to reclaim. By the spring of 1966, at 21 years old, I had finally escaped Frank Morrison's shadow and was preparing to leave Iowa forever. The civil lawsuit settlement had provided enough financial security to start fresh anywhere I chose, and I had decided on California as far from Millbrook as I could get without leaving the country entirely. But before I could close this chapter of my life completely, I needed answers to questions that had haunted me since discovering those yellowed letters in Frank's desk. Who was Thomas Kellerman, my biological father? Was he still alive somewhere? Did he know about my existence? Or had he moved through life blissfully unaware of the child he had left behind in wartime Iowa? The investigation required hiring a private detective from Chicago, a middle-aged woman named Margaret Fletcher, who specialized in finding missing persons. Margaret's approach was methodical and thorough, following paper trails through employment records, tax filings, military service documents, and voter registration rolls. Most people leave traces wherever they go, Margaret explained during our initial meeting in her cluttered Chicago office. The trick is knowing where to look and how to connect the dots. Your Thomas Kellerman was a traveling salesman in the 1940s, which means he probably changed jobs and locations frequently, but there will still be records. The breakthrough came in June 1966, when Margaret located Thomas Kellerman living in San Francisco, where he worked as a sales manager for a medical supply company. He was 52 years old, married to his second wife, with 3 children from his current marriage, a boy and 2 girls, who appeared to be living comfortable, privileged lives in a suburb overlooking San Francisco Bay. He has no idea about you, Margaret reported during our follow-up meeting. I spoke with some people who knew him during his time in Iowa, and apparently your mother never contacted him about the pregnancy. He left Millbrook in March 1945 and never looked back. As far as he knows, his brief relationship with Elizabeth Morrison was just another wartime romance that ended when normal life resumed. Margaret had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Thomas, complete with recent photographs that made my breath catch in my throat. The resemblance was undeniable, the same dark hair, the same stubborn chin, the same green eyes that had always seemed out of place in Frank Morrison's household. Looking at those pictures was like seeing a version of myself that might have existed in an alternate universe. "What do you want to do with this information?" Margaret asked, sliding the folder across her desk toward me. I studied the photographs for a long time, examining the face of the man who had given me half my DNA, but none of his protection or love. Thomas Kellerman looked happy in the pictures, relaxed and confident in a way that Frank Morrison had never been. His children appeared well-adjusted and genuinely loved evidence that he was capable of being a good father when he chose to be. The decision came suddenly with the clarity of absolute certainty. I didn't need Thomas Kellerman's acknowledgement or approval to validate my existence. I had survived Frank Morrison's abuse, and built my own strength from the ashes of my childhood. My worth as a human being wasn't dependent on claiming a place in Thomas's comfortable California life or disrupting the family he had built with his second wife.
Nothing,
I told Margaret, closing the folder without taking it.
I don't want to do anything with this information. I just needed to know that he existed, that he was real. That's enough for me now.
Margaret nodded approvingly. Sometimes the search is more important than the finding. You've got your answers, Sarah. Now you can decide what to do with the rest of your life. The most shocking surprise came 3 days before my departure from Iowa, when I was cleaning out the last of my belongings from the farmhouse that I was finally free to sell. Hidden behind a loose board in Mother's bedroom closet, I discovered a manila envelope that had been concealed there for over 20 years. Inside were documents that would change my understanding of everything my original birth certificate listing Thomas Kellerman as my father, along with letters from a lawyer in Des Moines who had been trying unsuccessfully to contact my mother and me about a significant inheritance. Thomas's father. My grandfather had died in 1958, leaving a substantial estate to be divided among his descendants. The lawyer had been searching for my mother and me for years, following the trail of Thomas's wartime activities, but his letters had been systematically intercepted by Frank Morrison and hidden away. The inheritance was still waiting, gathering interest in a trust account that now contained nearly $15,000 a fortune by 1966 standards. All I needed to claim it was proof of my identity and parentage documentation that I now possessed for the first time in my life. But the most precious item in that hidden envelope was a letter that my mother had written to me, dated just weeks before her death. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then Frank is gone, and you have found the truth. I was too weak and frightened to tell you while I lived. Thomas Kellerman was a good man who showed me kindness during the darkest period of my life, when I believed your father was dead in some Japanese prison camp, and I was facing the loss of our farm. You are the best part of both Thomas and me, and I pray that someday you will find the strength to forgive me for the choices that brought you so much pain. You deserve love and happiness and freedom. Don't let anyone, not Frank, not society, not even your own fears convince you otherwise. All my love and hope for your future mother. I sat on the dusty floor of that empty farmhouse and wept not from sadness, but from a strange sense of completion and peace. My mother had known about Frank's deception all along, had tried to protect me even when she was too sick and frightened to intervene directly. The inheritance from my grandfather was her final gift to me, a nest egg that would ensure I never had to depend on anyone else's charity or goodwill. The legal process of claiming the inheritance took several more weeks, but by August 1966, I was completely financially independent and ready to begin my new life. I used part of the money to establish a trust fund that would support the abuse survivors support group in Des Moines, ensuring that other women would have resources that had been denied to me during my own darkest years. Frank Morrison's criminal trial concluded in September 1966 with his conviction on multiple felony counts. He was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, a term that would effectively end his life behind bars, given his age and deteriorating health from decades of alcoholism. The rest of my inheritance went toward purchasing a small house in Santa Barbara, California, where the ocean breezes could carry away the last traces of Iowa dust storms, and the mountains provided a sense of security that flat farmland never could. I enrolled in nursing school at UC Santa Barbara, drawn to a profession that would allow me to help heal others the way Dr. Patterson had finally found the courage to help heal me. The transition to California was not without its challenges. For months, I woke up expecting to hear Frank's heavy footsteps in the hallway, his voice shouting orders from the kitchen. Therapy helped, but the real healing came from building a life so full of purpose and meaning that the shadows of my past could no longer reach me. I excelled in nursing school, graduating at the top of my class with a specialization in trauma care.
My professors noted my unusual ability to connect with patients who had suffered severe physical and psychological injuries, a skill that seemed to come naturally but was actually the result of hard-won experience. Frank Morrison died in state prison in 1973, 7 years into his sentence. I learned of his death through a brief newspaper clipping that Margaret Fletcher mailed to me along with a note. "The monster is finally dead. You can stop looking over your shoulder now?" But I had stopped looking over my shoulder years earlier. Frank's death was just confirmation of something I had already discovered. Survival isn't about outlasting your enemies. It's about building a life so rich and meaningful that their shadows can no longer touch you. I never contacted Thomas Kellerman directly, though I followed his family's progress through occasional internet searches in later years. His children grew up to become successful professionals, a doctor, a teacher, and an engineer. He lived to see grandchildren who carried his features and his name dying peacefully in his sleep in 2003, at the age of 89. He never knew that he had a daughter who had survived hell to build her own version of heaven on the California coast. In some ways, I found that knowledge oddly comforting. Thomas Kellerman had been a good man who had tried to bring comfort to a lonely woman during wartime. He didn't deserve to carry the burden of guilt for what Frank Morrison had chosen to do with that knowledge. On my 75th birthday in 2020, I received an unexpected letter from a young woman named Jennifer Chen, the granddaughter of Deputy Robert Chen, the officer who had finally found the courage to testify against Frank Morrison all those years ago. Jennifer was writing a college paper about corruption in rural law enforcement, and she wanted to include my story as an example of how victims could find justice even when the system seemed completely stacked against them. I invited Jennifer to my house in Santa Barbara, where we spent an entire afternoon sitting on my back porch overlooking the Pacific Ocean, talking about the past and its lessons for the present. She was young and idealistic, full of hope that the world could be made better through the exposure of its hidden cruelties. Do you ever regret fighting back?" she asked as the sun began to set over the water. "Do you ever wish you had just stayed quiet and tried to survive by keeping your head down?" I thought about her question for a long time before answering. "I regret many things about my childhood and young adulthood," I said finally. "I regret that my mother was too sick and frightened to protect me. I regret that the adults in my community chose willful blindness over intervention. I regret that it took me so long to find my voice and understand my own worth. But I don't regret fighting back when I finally found the strength to do so. That fight gave me back my life and my future." Jennifer published her paper the following year, and it won a national award for undergraduate journalism. She sent me a copy with an inscription that I treasure to this day, for Sarah Kellerman, who proved that survivors can become thrivers and that speaking truth to power can change the world. Today, I keep that paper on my kitchen table next to the photograph of my mother that I rescued from the farmhouse before it was sold. Sometimes, when the Santa Barbara fog rolls in from the ocean and obscures the mountains, I remember the storms that used to sweep across the Iowa plains, bringing terror and violence in their wake. But those storms are just memories now powerless to hurt me in this place I have made my own. I am Sarah Kellerman, daughter of Elizabeth Morrison and Thomas Kellerman, survivor of Frank Morrison's systematic cruelty, and architect of my own redemption. For the past 30 years, I have taught trauma nursing at UC Santa Barbara, specializing in the recognition and treatment of abuse. My students don't know their professor's personal history, but they learn from experience that was earned through pain and transformed into purpose. The gravel that bit into my knees that rainy night in 1965 taught me that I was stronger than I knew. Everything that came after the investigation, the trial, the healing, the new life I built from scratch was simply proof of that strength constructed one choice at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time. I survived Frank Morrison's attempts to destroy me. I thrived in spite of everything he did to break my spirit. And perhaps most importantly,
I learned to use my survival as a foundation for helping others find their own strength and their own voices. That in the end is the only victory that truly matters. The girl who once knelt on gravel beneath Iowa storm clouds now stands in California sunshine, teaching others to recognize the strength they didn't know they possessed. I am Sarah Kellerman. I am 75 years old. I am a survivor, a thriver, and a voice for those who are still learning to use theirs. This is my story. This is how I lived. This is how I learned that sometimes the only way out is through, and that healing is possible even after the darkest night.